Tonight we begin the Sacred Triduum, a 3-day period in which we enter most intensely into the mystery of our Lord's death and resurrection. Tomorrow we mark his death, and then we begin celebrating his resurrection after dark on Saturday night. Tonight we celebrate the Last Supper. At the Last Supper, Jesus ate the Passover meal with his apostles, and as he and they were observant Jews, they certainly would have celebrated that meal every year when the time came around. But in this particular Passover meal, Jesus takes the bread and says, "This is my body." He takes the wine and says, "This is my blood. Do this in memory of me." In this action, we see the beginning of the Eucharist. Jesus gave his body and blood, and we benefit from that gift every time we receive communion. Or even if we attend Mass without receiving communion, we still benefit in some way from that. Have you ever considered, though, why did our Lord give himself body and blood at the Last Supper and not sometime previous to that? After all, the Eucharist is such a wonderful gift. Why not give it earlier? Why not start it earlier with the apostles rather than waiting until the night before his death? Well, in part, it was because Jesus was still walking on earth with them. There was no need to give his body and blood sacramentally when they could see him literally face to face. Of course, at times we know that he did send his followers out to proclaim the good news. And so we can imagine what would it have been like when Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 to proclaim the good news in different towns. What would it have been like if they could have made our Lord present sacramentally in those journeys as well? Another possibility to consider, perhaps the apostles were not ready for the Eucharist until the very end. After all, when Jesus gave the Bread of Life discourse in John chapter 6, many people walked away. The apostles trusted Jesus enough to stay, but maybe they weren't ready at that point to actually eat his body and drink his blood. And so Jesus had to wait before instituting the Eucharist. He had to wait for them to be ready. Those are interesting possibilities to contemplate. It's interesting to consider how Jesus could have instituted the Eucharist earlier or what that would have meant. But the fact remains that he did indeed wait until basically his last meal before he died to give the Eucharist to his apostles. It was that Passover meal. And thus, being the Passover meal, it was connected to the history and the faith of the chosen people. And to this very day, the Eucharist can remind us of our own connection to the original Passover and Exodus event. Even more importantly, though, Jesus gives his body and blood at the Last Supper because he knows that he will be handed over. He will be arrested. He will ultimately be crucified. He gives his body and blood at the Last Supper because the events are being set in motion for him to give away his body and his blood for our salvation on the cross. We can never think of Holy Thursday or the Last Supper as standing in isolation from the events of Good Friday and Easter Sunday. They're all connected. Jesus gives himself in one way tonight and in another way tomorrow. And that's worth remembering too. Every time we receive communion, every time we attend Mass, we are connected, not just to a wonderful meal that Jesus and his apostles shared in the Eucharist. We are connected also with the cross and the resurrection of Jesus.